Accordingly, I want to sketch out today a cultural landscape that is overwhelming in its complexity, but I also want to draw attention to the dynamic principles and historical processes that formed that landscape. So it's something like looking at a mountain range and seeing the evidence of glaciers long gone, or of still powerful rivers, or of the gradual workings of shifting wind patterns. An understanding of race, I will argue, requires attention to the entire system of events, ideological, social, biological, historical, involved in its formation. Race, that is, cannot be separated from the dynamic process of its construction, for the formation of race is race. If we pay attention to race not as product, in other words, embodiment, but as process, our maps of cultural history unfold to reveal not a Euclidean delineation of social space, in other words, a color line, for example, or a problem in need of a clear, simple solution, but rather a social terrain characterized by fractal patterns. Mandelbrot's development of fractal geometry emerged in part from his attempt to account for those mathematical structures discovered through the years that did not fit the patterns of Euclid and Newton, and that accordingly challenged established models of order and measurement. Mandelbrot begins his seminal book, The Fractal Geometry of Nature, with a simple question: why is geometry often described as cold and dry? And he answers, one reason lies in its inability to describe the shape of a cloud, a mountain, a coastline, a tree, the things that you might expect geometry to account for. Clouds, he notes, are not spheres. Mountains are not cones. Coastlines are not circles. Bark is not smooth. Lightning doesn't travel in a straight line. Euclidean geometry is inadequate to describe, in other words, the world we find ourselves living in. Geometry, Mandelbrot believed, needed to account for the world as we find it, and not for a world that can fit into the neat circles and squares that we know how to understand. Similarly, I would suggest race cannot be defined by color or other physical features, nor can it be reduced to a set of essential features or practices, political positions or allegiances, and yet the history of race or the cultural processes shaped by the turbulent currents of history are everywhere evident in cultural life, with patterns of the racial eruptions that regularly punctuate the news familiar enough to be identified and ridiculed, defended and dismissed quickly enough to meet the deadlines for the next news cycle. I take it as a given then that no simple color line is adequate to describe the complex racial landscape in which we live, but I will argue as well that our lives are in fact defined by color lines that are both irregular and definitive. To appreciate this fact of American history and culture, one needs only look at the history of laws and practices by which race has been defined, redefined, and associated with cultural privilege and access. For example, the various laws, court decisions, and treaties that decided from time to time and place to place who would count as white. One might begin by looking at the 1790 Naturalization Act, which limited naturalization to free white persons. Certainly one would need to look at the complex legal, economic, and political system of slavery. One would need to consider as well the ways in which the 1850 fugitive slave law made life very insecure for free African Americans living in the North. One would need to consider the Dred Scott Supreme Court decision in 1857 in which Chief Justice Roger Taney, speaking for the majority decision, declared that African Americans had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. Probably one would want to study the process by which the Irish and other social groups were gathered into the pale of whiteness and granted more flexible, though often still controlled, privilege. And one might want to consider the reality that at various times throughout our history, it has been possible to be legally black in one state but not another, or to be white in one decade and non-white the next, as was the case with Chinese Americans in Louisiana in 1860 and 1870. One might want to look at the 1909 court decision that rendered Armenians white, or the 1923 Supreme Court decision that Asian Indians were non-white. And the list could go on, from the local to the federal level, from one region to the next, even from one neighborhood or school district to the next. These are laws that supported economic practices and social and political opportunities, laws that led to social arrangements that inspired new laws. but with the one consistent concern being the definition and protection of sometimes highly flexible understandings of white privilege and opportunity. And make no mistake, U.S. racial history is about whiteness. It is about defining whiteness, controlling whiteness, restricting access to the privileges associated with whiteness. And yet today, when we talk about race, whiteness almost never comes up. And as I'm suggesting, this history really has not gone away. This dynamic process shaped legal practices, which redirected the process in turn, as numerous legal decisions, large and small, did not simply verify or support an existing racial distinction, but also redefined what it meant to be either white or black, often building on or veering from previous redefinitions. This chaotic configuration of racializing forces, relations, and institutions has ensured not only that one's experience would be bound to one's racial identity at various times throughout U.S. history, but also that one's racial identity would be a highly contextualized, contingent, and always unstable entity. Quite simply, we can no more avoid the effects of the racial past than we can avoid the lingering effects of carbon dioxide produced in the past by declaring it irrelevant. Institutional race has encouraged cultural race, which has shaped cultural practices and new systemic formations, all of which position and shape individuals born into the culture, sometimes inspiring new manifestation of racial affiliations. Indeed, in America's long history of legally controlling access to social power and economic opportunity, many lines of relation have been established, a sort of genealogy of connections that are central to just about anybody's understanding of the cultural process. When people talk about race, some might say, some often say, that we shouldn't dwell on the past. But people who inherit money rarely refuse it on the grounds that the social conditions of the past, when the money was acquired, should have no relevance in the present. And those who benefit from a relative or a friend in getting a job or getting a loan or getting a second chance rarely refuse that help on the grounds that we should leave the historically developed lines of influence behind us and insist on an absolute model of individual access, ability, and merit. Since the processes of race position people economically, geographically, and historically, it would be difficult to argue that the world shaped by race is now inoperable. That race has played no part in shaping both the connections we enjoy and our understanding of how those connections might function. Throughout our lives, we acknowledge in ways large and small, collectively and individually, that the order of the past has a lot to do with the opportunities of the present. But those acknowledgments are largely absent from a great many discussions of race. What is white about white people, then, is not the color of our skin, which is not, after all, white, but rather the historical situation which has made white bodies such able predictors of experience, understanding, and access to privilege and cultural authority. A whiteness, in other words, that cannot be transcended simply by good intentions or by the reach of an individual's consciousness. To attend to the historical process by which race has been constructed, after all, is to recognize that instead of race being somewhere in individuals, something you can see, skin color, whatever, race is in fact everywhere. In the way we live, the images we encounter in popular culture, the way wealth and access to power are passed from one generation to the next, the way that schools are funded, and the ways in which justice has been defined in different places and at different times throughout our nation's history. To talk about white people, then, is not to talk about who they are, but rather to address who, where, when, and perhaps even why they've